Well, ladies and gents, welcome back from lunch. And we have two panels this afternoon to wrap up the Eurasian Media Forum. This next one, panel session 7, explains and explores a phrase that you'll hear more and more as digital technology advances. And that phrase is blockchain. Blockchain's behind the growth in cryptocurrencies, for example, such as Bitcoin, and is a technological development which people are having to understand sooner rather than later. And to help us understand how this digital revolution is taking place, we have a moderator who's Vice President of Content Sales and Partnerships at CNN. He's come from the UK. Please, a warm welcome for Greg Beichman.
Well, thanks very much, Riz, and thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. We met over lunch before the session, and got a little contentious, a little bit emotional, so I think we're going to have a very engaging entertainment conversation this afternoon, and I really would encourage everyone to do their best to participate. We'll take questions, we'll take skeptics. We'd love to hear from you. So again, as Riz said, I'm Greg from CNN International. It's really a delight to be here with you today. Like so many other industries, you know, news, the industry that I've been in for my entire career, has been so disrupted and changed by the emergence of digital technology, by the emergence of the internet. Everyone can be a publisher, and at CNN, you know, this is something that's hit us really quickly. We now understand that the consumption of our news will start on a mobile device. People will first see our news here. If they're getting our news here, well, what are we going to do on the big screen? It's a big question. We don't want to repeat that experience. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we build engaging content and experiences for people in what's a very changed media consumption environment. We've also had to think about, you know, the industry and how do we fund it? And of course, advertisers now, they want to buy very targeted, segmented audiences. They want to know who exactly their advertisement is reaching. And that's also something that we'll speak a little bit later today about, which is personalization and data and what that all means. But taking a step back from my industry, you know, there's no escaping the influence of technology. From the way we raise children to the way we take care of our elderly, its fabric is deeply part of our lives. And even here in Kazakhstan, in the smallest town, you can see its impact. You know, for me, the biggest news last year wasn't Brexit, it wasn't Donald Trump, it was Amazon setting up a completely automated store in Seattle where people could walk in, take an item, and have it automatically billed back to their Amazon account. These types of disruptive uses of technology, I think, are going to have a strong impact on how we live our lives and on our future. And we see this everywhere, not just in the rarefied atmosphere of Silicon Valley or of, what's it called in Shoreditch in London. It's all around, and indeed in emerging economies like Kazakhstan. We share our lives with each other on social media. We agree to have our data gathered by corporates, and in some cases we don't agree. And we effectively live in public. We are living shared lives and experiences right now. So in that context, you know, we're going to look today at blockchain and some other technologies which are more about security and control. And I think it'll be really interesting to explore what that means. Can the same technologies which connect us and have created this new environment for consuming so many things, can they also be secure? And can there be a trustworthy infrastructure built around that technology? So to help us do that, we've got a pretty cool bunch of people with us today, and I'll introduce them. First, we've got Tyler Smith, who's Director of Energy at Consensus. You can join us up on stage. We also have with us someone who's going to be our skeptic, our chief skeptic, hopefully, which is Brett Scott. He is listed as a blockchain expert, not a blockchain doubter, but he's a journalist who covers financial markets, cryptocurrency, emerging financial tech. We also have with us Artur Saudubayev, who is from Kazakhstan's Nazarbayev University, who has worked a lot with robotics, AI, the singularity. He'll help us think about how these technologies are transforming lives. Luke Aikman with us from Nudge Digital, who has launched a number of digital businesses, sold some, others have failed. He'll have things to share. Pedro Fuentes, who's the head of the PKI platform, who looks at encryption technology and how to really integrate it with day-to-day use. And finally, Matej Michalko, who has launched the Decent Foundation, which is taking blockchain technology and using it in one use case around content. So I'd like to kick it off because I think blockchain is really, it's talked about in one of the FT articles I saw recently. You know, it's thought of as a very hyped technology, but also a very necessary technology. So to help us shed some light on what it really is, Tyler, give us, in 2 minutes, or if you need 3, you can do it, blockchain.
I'm going to need 3.
All right, you have it. And you have to hit the microphone button, unfortunately, yeah.
So this is a really big challenge, actually, because the technology is quite a grab bag of previously existing technologies that come together to facilitate something that the sum is much greater than the individual parts. So what I want you to envision is something that's a low-lying protocol, something that you generally don't interface with meaningfully in using an application, but sits behind that application. Take, for instance, the internet communication protocol called TCP/IP. Most people would not sit here and try to explain to you how TCP/IP works. Blockchain is like that. However, the implications for blockchain are exciting, just as TCP/IP was exciting in the early emergence of the internet. Blockchain is at the same stage that the internet was back in 1993, 1994. If you remember back then, not very many people had an email account yet, and email wasn't easy to use. Blockchain is much like that, yet people now see the promises that can come. So let me try to explain to you how it works. I want you to picture an Excel spreadsheet. Everyone knows what that looks like. There's data that is organized in columns and rows. Now, what if there was a distributed set of nodes around the world that all shared the same spreadsheet? And whenever one spreadsheet updated, all the rest would update reliably using the same protocol. And everything that you do on this spreadsheet is tracked and verified by all the nodes of the network. You now have the basis for what Bitcoin looks like, a value transfer mechanism where all nodes agree as to who owns what Bitcoin. However, blockchain didn't stop after its first implementation with Bitcoin. It's evolved to be something much grander now. We've recently had new networks come about. I want you to go back to that Excel spreadsheet, only now envision the possibility of running what they call a macro, or a small program that's embedded in the spreadsheet. Only this program now exists on all the nodes of the network and will execute exactly as it is programmed with the data associated with the network. This now provides a huge amount of possibilities for people to interact that don't necessarily trust each other. And I think we'd all agree that money is probably the most contentious thing in the world. And the blockchain has enabled a system by which people can transfer value to each other without having to trust each other. Now, what happens when you can actually provide automated business process programs that can be trusted across entities that don't trust each other? Well, now you open the possibility, let's take a very simple example of automated escrow. You no longer need a third party to act as the trusted middleman because a program can actually facilitate that for you automatically. And as soon as one party adds their part of the deal and the other party adds theirs, they atomically swap and are given the transaction. No one needed to be involved in the middle. And I think that is one of the most intriguing aspects. And that's why you see companies, that's why you see startups starting to develop these more sophisticated ways of interacting without middlemen.
Okay, that's 3 minutes.
I hope I did a good enough job.
I get it, but okay, let's go to...
Elaborate.
Say again?
I could elaborate a bit.
Go ahead.
So first of all, I don't actually claim to be a blockchain expert. I look a lot at many different types of attempts to change economic systems, of which blockchain is one. And I think if you want to try and grasp maybe the context that blockchain emerged in, the original sort of impulse behind it was, if you have a giant network of strangers who do not know each other, how would you find a way for them to essentially coordinate action between themselves? And historically, we've used central parties to do that. So for example, this conference right now has a central organizing committee that coordinates everything. All right? If we were all disparate around the world, we ourselves wouldn't be able to bring this conference together. Whereas the blockchain technology, the original sort of impulse was, how would you create an infrastructure whereby strangers can essentially coordinate action between themselves without relying upon a central party? And Bitcoin happened to be doing that in the context of moving monetary tokens around. Because right now, for example, you currently rely on banks to move those tokens around. And you've already mentioned that concept then got pushed into new ideas. So, for example, we could use this for transferring shares. We can start to do various types of automated processes where we are what they call smart contracts, where you add sort of automated elements to the network. But I think one of the kind of it's important maybe now to understand that what's happened in the blockchain community to try and clarify the ongoing future debate, because there's been a whole bunch of forks in the community. In the original vision, essentially the critique was around centralization, and you had various parties, ideological parties like conservative libertarians who critiqued the state. That was one of the reasons why they wanted that. Then you had more communitarian-minded people who said, this is a way for us to coordinate action as a kind of cooperative. But now, essentially, what's happened, you've had an emergence of what's called private blockchain systems, which are sort of controlled versions of the technology that are kind of closed down and put into very controlled settings. And a lot of what Tyler, I guess what you guys at Consensus will be working on is essentially trying to build these sort of blockchain systems that are no longer actually open, but are controlled by, for example, a small group of banks or corporation or something like that. A second,
we actually build on both. Equally.
You have to do both. But those are conceptually now separate. And there's a second sort of psychological change that's been occurring as well. The original vision around Bitcoin and blockchain was that participants, people in the network would be participants. We would all be collectively doing something. Whereas the mentality has slowly shifted towards a more sort of Silicon Valley style mentality, which is saying, actually, we'll get a small group of people who will provide a service, and then you will use this infrastructure.
So that sounds more like a standard type of a tech approach
so
from
part of the
Silicon
critique
Valley.
would be, in some ways, a lot of the existing blockchain or the new blockchain platforms are essentially just trying to do business as usual in a new kind of way.
Let me move on. I want to, before we go back into the kind of, maybe the ethics of the infrastructure, I want to speak maybe to Mate about the thing that he's built. You know, as a good example, or maybe an example of what can be built with blockchain. Give us a sense of the application that you're building with Decent.
Myself, I've been in the blockchain, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency industry for 6 years as of today. So I have seen the ecosystem from many different angles, as a simple user, as a miner, as a developer, and as an entrepreneur, which I'm now. So concerning the use case, we are currently solving, my company, the company I founded, Decent Foundation, is the digital content distribution from the authors to content consumers. So let's maybe try to think, how is this done today, right? So imagine you are an author, you want to publish an ebook, so we go to Amazon or another online, content distribution company. So there are terms and conditions you need to comply with. It takes some time. Then you upload your ebook. It can be sold only in some formats that Amazon supports. And then you start earning money, right? So let's say your book is $20 and you are very successful and you sell 100 copies the first week. So you should be about to get $2,000 US. But this is not the case with Amazon, right? You get only something about like half of this amount. So something about the 1,000. and the 50% royalty goes to Amazon. And what we are building with blockchain, we are reducing this transaction cost to almost zero.
So the concept is a content creator could go to market with their content, sell directly, and take something closer to 100% of the cost of the product.
Very close to 100%. Yes, and this is only the beginning of the story, right? Then let's start about ratings, right? You are on Amazon, you see the reviews of the books, right? You have 5 stars, 1 star, 3 stars, you have comments. You know, as Amazon is a centralized company, as Brett mentioned, you know, the committee and so on, so there is some kind of, you know, a middleman. And on Amazon, there is no way to verify or validate whether the data that are posted there are true or not, whether the reviews are true or not, right? Whether they are posted by Amazon or they are really posted by users. And this is what blockchain is solving. Blockchain is bringing the truth into business processes. Blockchain is bringing the truth into content distribution.
Thanks. That's a really clear, I think, definition of what blockchain can do. Luke, you've built a number of tech businesses over the years. What do you think? Is this something that can be built into applications today, and how relevant is it for the things you
Yeah, I mean, as consensus approving and many others, it certainly can be built into applications today. But I think there's a fundamental problem with some of the ideology around blockchain when we're talking about things such as authors selling directly to an audience and there being no transaction cost. The reality is that the costs in the middle, the intermediary, if you like, that blockchain removes from the specific example, are providing value at every stage, and that's why they charge. If I'm going to write a book, which if I do, I suggest none of you read, but if I do write a book and I choose to publish that, I have 2 options. I can go direct to market, and that already exists, right? I can go and stick my book on a website, I can use Gumroad, I can use one of the multiple fantastic pieces of software that will allow me to sell it at almost no commission other than the processing fees, which are about 2.5% plus 12p, give or take. But if I go to market on my own, I then have to put together a huge marketing budget to get anywhere near Amazon's audience. In fact, I won't get anywhere near Amazon's audience. And in fact, if I don't publish on Amazon, for example, I'm not really going to hit the Kindle market. And Amazon spent a lot of time and money creating the Kindle market.
Okay, I get it with respect to Amazon and
Yeah.
content. You know, people build marketplaces, there are brands. We go to Netflix or Amazon to do this, and that's probably going to continue. But what else can you build with this? I mean, I guess is my question, because you're empowering people this trust and sort of this trust architecture on their product or service. Can you name an example where it is necessary?
Yeah, absolutely. So an example that's frequently used in the blockchain community is land registry. And it's a fantastic example in that blockchain, one of the things blockchain does, and I'm not sure this came across clearly, but it removes the need for a trusted party. You have a perfect record of transaction that can never be argued with.
So no notaries?
No notaries. So in England, for example, where we don't have a huge, it's inefficient as hell, land registry, but we don't have a huge problem whereby if I sell you my house, no one's then going to come and sell you the same house again. But in Ghana, for example, the same piece of land is sold 6, 7, 8 times, and you're still not sure if you've owned it. So you could use blockchain really effectively to remove the, in inverted commas, trusted or distrusted, in Ghana's case, party. But the difficulty is, to implement blockchain for that use case, the person in the middle that's profiting from the resale of the land over and over and over again would have to be on board, because all the land would need to be, in inverted commas, identified and boarded up before it was traded. And so, although in theory and ideologically there could be groundswell, and perhaps all the people of Ghana would decide that they'd suddenly become perfect landowners and register themselves.
I mean, what you're really saying is it comes back to people.
Yeah, it comes back to...
And people have to sign up to this platform and believe in it.
Yeah, we're going to need a trusted party to force the implementation of a platform that requires no trusted party, if you see what I mean. Yeah. But it's the beneficiary of the corruption that is the guy that would have to implement it. And
Pedro, you work for PSI. You do an alternate type of security and validation and verification system. What do you see as the sort of weaknesses in this, or is this just a battle of competing technologies?
Yeah, well, as coming from a company which is a trust service provider, we are typically seen as evil from the blockchain promoters. So basically we are this bad trusted third party, which everyone is trying to avoid. From our perspective, blockchain is really blowing our minds. It's something that definitely has a bright future, but there are some concerns that I think that are not properly taken. And maybe it can have some link to, for example, the Saxon approach to identity, where this is an optional thing. So in the United States, you don't have the concept of a national identity, so people has the driver license. In England, there's also optional. I mean, it's not such this concept. And we see a link between this approach to blockchain coming from these countries with a very pragmatic approach to identity. And precisely, this is what I think is the main concern for us. Blockchain is a great technology to protect the transaction, to ensure the integrity of a transaction, but it's not right now the way it's envisioned. It's not that good to ensure the identity of the intervenient in a transaction.
But assuming that, okay, blockchain is not perfect, no technology is, but essentially the need is there for a blockchain type of technology which allows privacy and security around transactions. I think we'd all agree on that. It's a required thing, or am I getting it wrong?
But for me, it's fundamental to bring a real, to really bring a real trust, because we are talking about trust. In blockchain is distributed trust. To really trust a transaction for me is fundamental to being able to ensure the identity of the intervenants. And for that, more than technology, I think that blockchain, which is lacking, is proper regulation, which is very strongly enforced in other environments, like the traditional digital certificates, where you have the role of accredited service providers or accredited
So government and regulation are going to have to play a role in how these things are really rolled out?
I think it's governments are must play a key role on this.
Artur, you teach here in Kazakhstan. Obviously, we are in a very emerging economy here. What are the things that a country like Kazakhstan can take away from blockchain? Are there opportunities to build things here that could be used in the rest of the world?
Thank you. There are a lot of opportunities here. The very important thing I've been lucky to observe. I'm 28 years old. I've been born 2 years before.
I think you are the youngest guy on the stage.
Thank you.
We can use that officially now. If he isn't the youngest, please raise your hand. Good.
I was born 2 years before we got our independence. And I was growing with the country. And I was seeing things change literally during how I changed, like how credit cards came, how credit cards offered cashback just recently, and we were like, oh my God, is this free money? And things like that. How Facebook came, it became really an empowering tool in the society. A lot of people went there, a lot of people saw that as a panel for discussion, for manifestation. And importantly, government, administration reflected very well with that. There's attorney's office responding to people doing changes, municipalities. It worked very well, I think. It moved us a lot further from where we were. And blockchain in this case is critical as well. There are a lot of nuances of what the technical possibilities of what exact products should we deliver in Kazakhstan. But I want to emphasize not on these technicalities, but rather on the potential impact. Blockchain
inherently delivers transparency for all the transactions. Shall it be a hybrid system working with a relational system, relational database? It delivers transactions, transparency on multiple nodes, and people can see them. That is a very big instrument to develop trust in people, not only between each other, as blockchain drives us to do, but to the institutions, to the government. So we are already talking about implementing our taxation system on blockchain. And that'll be amazing. That will be very functional thing to do and important, impactful, because now to look into the taxation system and search something which happened quite some time ago is challenging. If it's blockchain, that changes things and people see it, people start to believe maybe. So it's very important. And then central bank issuing assets. What I really like about blockchain, there's a lot of argument, but very important thing is that it gives you a choice. And choice is always good. To me, blockchain is very important because it touches really the basic, the most essential process in society, the exchange. That's why the disruption it can bring are considered as major. And I think enabling this trust between people and erasing borders in the future.
So
because
I can see it in government, and that's sort of, you know, we're in a democracy, we vote for our leaders. My question, maybe it's for Tyler, you know, a lot of people make money from transparency not existing. So is transparent, I mean, is it really going to, it sounds like it could really disrupt things and actually people could lose money. How adapt, I mean, you're working with the energy industry particularly, I mean, is it really being adapted to the level of that we're talking about here, which is transparency on prices, distribution, all these other areas where actually today, arguably, money is made?
Yeah, so let me ground this for some people in real terms for real business. What does this mean to companies making money? Because I recently left BHP Billiton, which is the largest mining company in the world, and I was their head of blockchain. We built a production-grade supply chain for oil and gas samples. That's rock and fluid samples coming out of the well. And we built a production-grade supply chain to manage those using a blockchain, using the Ethereum blockchain, which I failed to mention is a lot. So you can think of the blockchain ecosystem as being quite fragmented right now, and a lot of consolidation and standardization is happening on top of Ethereum, which is kind of Bitcoin 2.0. And it's being driven by an organization, a standards body called the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which the people that you've heard of, like JP Morgan, like BP Oil and Gas, like BNY Mellon, like Microsoft, Intel, Accenture, they're all a part and joining in this organization to create standards. So we created this production grade application for an enterprise. And what we see is just massive adoption, or at least interest. Every major bank has a research group looking at blockchain. Every major oil and gas company has a research group looking at blockchain on how they become more efficient in their supply chains, how they become more efficient in their accounting. And part of this is transparency. How do you work together with your vendors, your partners, your regulators in order to create a more efficient system? And the reason why people are trusting it is because we have an ecosystem now in the wild that public blockchains are able to secure over $100 billion worth of value. That's a lot of money. And if we can secure money this way, we can secure other types of information like the cargo on a ship, like a vote in an election, like the identity of an individual. And what we're seeing is that companies see those savings. We're talking 30 to 50% savings in your back office. And that's why they want to build these private, more controlled environments in which to learn and grow that ecosystem. But we're going to eventually see them want to interact across a public network. The comparison has been made, and it's quite good, that the public blockchains are like the internet, and private blockchains are like the walled off intranets. And if you remember the evolution of the internet, intranets gained rapid popularity amongst companies. But quickly they began to see the value of interacting across a public network. And that's why the two interoperate together.
Yeah, I certainly remember the first internet. Brett, pick this apart. We're talking, we have a bit of a utopian vision around blockchain delivering transparency, but is that really in companies' interests? And government's interests?
I think maybe like Tyler is articulating the pretty standard, and I'm not against what Tyler's arguing, but it's, in some ways it's not like particularly profound. It's just saying we found a more efficient way to do what we already do, really. I mean, that's kind of what it is. I mean, if you think about, like, for example, the internet, which we are kind of romanticizing, well, what happened to the internet? The internet's become incredibly centralized. It has giant dominating parties like Google and Amazon who actually completely dominate it. And the actual structure of the internet is that you've got these huge nodes and then all these people who use them, for example, Facebook. And sure, in the short term, you can experience these things as being empowering in some kind of narrow sense, but in the long term, you essentially lose huge amounts of autonomy and you slowly have your life taken over by giant infrastructures that you do not control. You might like that or not, but I guess part of the sort of original quote-unquote utopian vision of some of the blockchain stuff was, well, we might actually be able to find an alternative infrastructure that somehow enables authentic forms of decentralization. And I don't want to romanticize that, but I don't really think that a lot of the sort of inter-company stuff happening right now really fundamentally challenges that in any kind of business models are built on centralizing and essentially granting selective access to things, right? You don't make profit unless you do that.
And is that why consumers should care, ultimately? Because, I mean, why should consumers care about blockchain? I'll flip it back to you, and maybe the wider group.
But if you're coming from a standard sort of like narrow market perspective, you'll probably use this type of, like, I mean, the concept of the consumer itself, right? Like the sort of person who wanders around a market looking for goods. And who, you know, for example, if you lower prices, it's good for a consumer. If you have a kind of a holistic perspective on economies, which, I mean, I come from a kind of more critical perspective on economies, you'll see that, you know, the consumer archetype is like half of a person, right? It's this person who looks for goods. What happens to the other half of people's, you know, the producers, the sort of like the community member, all these types of things, right? So sure, you might narrowly lower prices by increasing the efficiency, but more interesting is actually like the types of things like Descent, where you're actually trying to create a kind of a community of producers. I mean, I found that type of stuff more interesting than the sort of like, we're going to increase the efficiency of BHP Billiton's a rock sample process, which is cool, but it's not particularly amazing, you know?
Yeah, but then what about enabling the billions of people around the world who are unbanked to maintain a wallet on their phone with cryptocurrency on it that will allow them to make payments all around the world at low cost? Or what about the billions of people around the world that don't have an identity solution? They don't have a passport, they don't have an ID card, they can't get a credit card. You know, the blockchain enables them. I understand what you're saying, that like, don't buy into the corporate bull, right? Why do we want to help big companies? Well, but the reality is that they work symbiotically, right? We have a whole bunch of needs that the blockchain can fulfill for these people who are underserved in our societies. But at the same time, companies can become more efficient as well. It's the same technology.
I'll just make 2 points on that, because, I mean, first of all, a lot of what's been talked about in blockchain circles is not so much blockchain, but digitization, essentially talking about some form of automation. You find these examples, people saying, oh, no, you know, in the past we used to have stuff on paper, now you can put it on blockchain. Well, actually, you can put it on a centralized server as well. You're talking about digitization and automation process. It doesn't necessarily require blockchain. Secondly, technological solutions more generally are, you have to put them in context. So I work on stuff around financial inclusion. The mere fact, for example, of providing somebody with a bank account or providing some new technology to do something doesn't solve the underlying socioeconomic and reasons why people have low incomes, for example. So I'm not against, for example, using some kind of blockchain thing for quote-unquote the unbanked, whether you think it's good to bring people into the formal financial system, but by itself it doesn't really solve the problem.
And I want to go back maybe to Pedro or maybe to Luke. I mean, these things are built by people. It's code built by people. Can it crash? I mean, is it really as secure as what we're hearing here? Maybe Pedro.
Yeah, well, I will say that the technology basis of blockchain is pretty robust. So I don't, well, there have been some history about flaws in the initial implementations. But I will say that the technology itself is not the issue. Okay, for me, the main issue is what I'm coming back to my previous statement, is that we are talking about identity. We are talking about trust. If we go to other traditional businesses, let's think, for example, in SSL certificates. When you connect to a web page and you see the HTTPS, and thanks to that, you are able to trust that you are connected to a genuine website controlled by a company, is because there's agreement, a consensus among the industry about the best practices that we have to apply to identify someone that is requesting this digital certificate to identify the website. So this is a very good example of how not even governmental regulation, but industry consensus and best practices can help to increase the trust in something as basic as connecting to a website. In the case of blockchain, what we are missing is this. And by this, I think that there are two main aspects that are missing. One is, first of all, the technical controls on the service providers. I mean, if we think on in the world of trust service providers, digital identity, digital certificate providers, we have audit controls, we have entities, independent entities that can audit the service providers to ensure that they are acting according to the industry practice and best practices. We don't have this in blockchain. So anyone can build their system and put it operational, and no one will be able to control it because there's not this audit criteria. And on the other side, there's also the role of the service provider as, if we think on the identity, on the controls that they have to apply to really put someone into the game. So if I have to enroll a person to participate in the system, what are the controls that should be applied for this to be really legally binding? And for this, then in this case, the governments have a more predominant role.
So there are human susceptibilities layered into even the process of putting people on these systems, which
I would say that it's not that much
tough.
about the technology infrastructure or the design of the blockchain technology, but the way it's being implemented.
Luke, you might have had a thought here.
Well, I think that blockchain's a buzzword right now. And it's a buzzword because it's an incredibly powerful technology, but the reality is consumers, in my humble and possibly very wrong, and I'm happy to be proved wrong opinion, aren't going to see huge differences in the way that we interact with one another or each other in the near future. It's going to be a fantastic underlying technology that makes all sorts of things more and more and more efficient. But the reality is humans like convenience, and humans pay for convenience. And while this technology is still in its early stages, over lunch earlier, we likened it to the electric motor, right? When the first electric motor was put on the table, everyone said, that's great, but what are we going to use it for? 5 years later, everything had an electric motor in it. I'm sure blockchain will be similar. But in reality, there's always going to be a corporate face on the front of a technology that's this, if you like, this powerful, like a Facebook that aids us to use the blockchain to bring people together, or like an Amazon that aids us to transact. So I don't want to kill the bubble. I think blockchain's awesome. I'm a geek. And I really like the technology.
Okay.
But there are going to have to be people and corporations, and most importantly governments, where there's possibly the most opportunity for blockchain to bring around revolutions in trust in society. Those changes are going to be very difficult to make bottom up.
So I'm actually going to interject that while that may be true about some of the solutions that blockchains may bring, I would argue that there's 10,000 refugees right now that are receiving aid through the UN by virtue of a blockchain, right? That is changing the way they receive their aid. It's more efficient. Their identities can be tracked, right? That is a huge problem around the world for refugees. And that is changing because this technology enables a complete step change in the way we can deal with them, right? So maybe you'll see incremental efficiencies in some areas. In other areas, it will change the way that their lives operate.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree, right? That's wholesale change. But the face for the consumer, like the UN has on one side of it sent some cash in Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency, or using a blockchain technology to transfer, in inverted commas, real money. So the consumer, what they see is real money land. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying blockchain provides a fundamental opportunity for underlying technologies. What I'm saying is that the consumer, on the consumer face of it, there's very likely going to be a company providing that face or a government providing that face of the technology.
So Gartner have said that blockchain is on its peak of inflated expectations section, which actually isn't such a damning statement if you ask me, because expectations are always very high. But Matej, is there a business behind what you're building? It's not just a sort of an attempt to liberate artists. There is a business behind it, I presume, a commercial opportunity.
Yes, exactly, and that's why I'm working on this project, and I'm already putting my full-time focus for the last 2 years in this end. And you mentioned Gartner, right? So many of you and many of us know the Gartner hype cycle that has been mentioned over here. So let's just take cryptocurrency, right? It appeared on Gartner hype cycle for the first time in 2015. So Gartner hype cycle contained cryptocurrency. And what happened in 2016, cryptocurrency disappeared. Yeah. And what appeared there was blockchain, right? With a dark blue point. And the dark blue point means 5 to 10 years until the adoption by mainstream markets, according to Gartner, in 2016, right? Right now we are in 2017, and again, according to Gartner or many other market research firms or companies, it will take some time. It will take a few years.
Sure.
We are like talking about the internet in 1995, talking about the World Wide Web in 1995. Just try to imagine that time, right? Using the dial-up connection, or having many or most of the European universities that didn't have internet. People went to libraries, to look for books, and so on. And now everything changed, right? And who knew this in 1995? That such a disruptive technology as the internet is would look like in 2017. So getting back to the use case of content distribution, we are doing it driven by the actual use case, right? Which means reducing the transaction cost and bringing the transparency. And we mobilized tens of thousands of independent artists and companies that will start to use our platform after its launch. So we will launch it, people will put their content on it, and we will see where it goes. But my vision is that within few years from now, this will be one of the main content distribution protocols worldwide. It will be something fixing the internet as it is now.
So when Tyler put it as a blockchain is like TCP/IP, it clicked in my mind, and it's clear blockchain's not going away. It's going to drive a whole lot of new efficiency, as are so many other technologies, and it's going to drive transparency. Maybe my question for Artur, is what I was trying to reference in my first comments, which is automation, efficiency. These things are coming up fast, and my question is, and maybe it's to everyone, will governments be able to keep up with all this? Will employment be able to keep up with all this? People make money through inefficiency. There are people employed because of inefficiency in distribution, businesses, and selling things. Will humanity be able to keep up? How do we educate? How do we build things that keep people busy, that don't destroy their jobs and livelihoods?
We've been through some history of automation reducing some professional jobs numbers. I'm saying reducing because people tend to think that we lost a lot of professions. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, we lost only around 2 professions in the last four decades. One of them was just recently in Moscow. There's these people observing the elevators in the subway, and they decided that this is not maybe efficient anymore. They shouldn't observe safety on the elevators, on the escalators. Other jobs reduced in the demand to people, yes, that's true. But we've always observed that new jobs appeared, people retrained, people were redirected somehow. So there was relative balance. Accenture is a good example. This year they replaced 17,000 people with AI. They automated the process, one of the processes internal to the company. But what they did was amazing because they retrained them all and they didn't fire a single person out of 17,000. But this is not necessarily how it will happen. Likely the speed will bring us to the fact that we can't keep up and people will lose their jobs, or the pace at which they need to retrain and the things they need to grasp for the new job is not feasible in the time frame. So maybe there will be this generation lost in this several year or maybe a couple of decades challenge. But eventually we'll have to. It's the same thing as will governments be able to keep up with blockchain? Well, they are kind of forced to, because as I see it, blockchain as an effort, if you abstract, it's a expression and manifestation of discontent of how the things are. Let's say millennials being discontent how things are. And I'm coming from the fact that the biggest demand for Bitcoin is coming from Venezuela and Argentina. And we talk about this bubble, which the blockchain is, but the thing is, there's a lot of bubbles. The bonds, overbooked bonds for 100 years from Argentina, or Facebook worth more than MSCI India. So people are kind of running away from one bubble, maybe to another. We don't know, we'll see. But it's kind of a natural process. And governments will have to keep up because they will see that you cannot just bring your economy to the fact that you need to perform some major reform on your currency and people will be just okay with that. No, they will have a second channel. They will maybe try to escape this problem through cryptocurrency. That's what really pumped up the price recently, right, over the last year. And India as well, their currency reform also motivated people to go into there. So I cannot say whether they will be able to keep up, but they are certainly mostly incentivized.
We've certainly seen some populism backlash, a sort of resentment probably in older people, even people in their sort of 40s who didn't necessarily start off in internet-related businesses. We've seen that this year in some of the developed economies. I mean, what's your take, Scott, on, are we headed to a world where things are too automated and...
Well, actually, I teach at this place called Singularity University, which is this like technological utopian sort of, how would I describe it? Like almost like a cult, I guess, but like in Silicon Valley, and it's pretty cool actually. It's a Mountain View based off the NASA research base, and essentially the underlying sort of, I guess, ideology is one of extreme automation. And then a vision of liberation that goes along with that, this idea that somehow extreme automation will liberate humanity, and this is what the concept of singularity is, which is kind of like the automation of automation, where it just like becomes... but at some point, the philosophy kind of breaks down because I would tend to argue it's based on a sort of a notion that the underlying thing that drives humanity is the desire for material goods and convenience. Now, certainly in the short term, that might be the case. People desire convenience in the short term. They desire things in the short term. But the existential threat in the long term is the sort of fundamental degradation of the human soul. Somehow you lose connection to all reality and actual engagement with the world. Now, this is kind of quite far off into the future, but this is one of the underlying sort of reasons why this debate's coming up. But if you look at like the actual drivers of automation, it's not just like a natural process that happens through some kind of force of nature. It's to do with particular profit business models where you're essentially trying to cut your costs, so you will automate as much as you possibly can, or else it's because you're trying to control something. So I guess I would predict that what we're going to see, especially in Western economies where there's already this, places like New York and London where people are starting to feel this sort of emptiness that's emerging, is you're going to start to find backlashes against these extreme forms of technological sort of triumphalism. But I mean, it's interesting to see. My last point is that Mark Zuckerberg recently started advocating basic income. And the reason why he's doing that is that he realizes that the technology that he's building, which is essentially these extreme, highly scalable technologies of coordination and control, will potentially undermine the very basis of a capitalist economy, and he probably needs to start thinking about how he's going to deal with that.
That's very, very simple, straightforward stuff. I saw a film recently where, it was in the future, and one of the key jobs people had was a guy was writing greeting cards because it was something a computer couldn't do. I guess we'll all have to be very creative. I was curious, we have with us also in the audience Dr. Wang Wei from China, who has, and I was curious, you've spent a lot of time looking at technology and looking at Bitcoin and blockchain implementation in China, and I was curious for your experience, a larger, more developed economy than, say, India, where they've had a currency reform.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored. Actually, I'm sitting here and feel excited. I'm involved with blockchain, Bitcoin, about 3 years, but now those kind of panel discussions happen almost every day in China.
Wow.
Just a couple months ago, there's one national conference about Bitcoin and blockchain. 5,000 audience there. The people excited. A lot of people from university, entrepreneurs is there. They just chanting for the next revolution. So the blockchain and digital economy belongs to the future. So that's for sure. So people very passionate about it. But as us, we have been so much involved in traditional economy. I just feel a couple of challenge right now. I will share with what we do in China. Number one challenge, the regulation. If you climb the digital or blockchain revolution, normally regulator will against you. I think it's everywhere. In China, special. You talk about the decentralized, you talk about the anti-government monopoly or something like that. The first couple of years, the government is very skeptical and keep long distance about this. And then we just like how to convince government support you. So we design, at first, I still remember 3 years ago, we bring a lot of people talk about how blockchain can anti-fraud in taxation, in smuggling, of crime, something like that. And gradually get the legitimate department to join us. And then gradually central bank, there's 5 government central bank come to us. Governor central bank come to us. By the way, we set up probably the first museum. It's called a Museum of Fintechs in China, in Beijing. So there
Museum of
Fintech. We talk about, we show the P2P, crowdfunding, blockchain, and survey the history, even just the 2 years history, but we trace back 1,000 years about the accounting or whatever. So this museum, and then a lot of people come to museum to see that, and even the regulators come, they're convinced. So China government right now is pretty supporting the blockchain at this moment. Probably not for the Bitcoin. So number one, you had to deal with regulators. And number two, you had to convince people to make money, especially in a business, especially the investment, the investors. So you had to design a lot of application scenario. So that's right now very buzzword, the scenes for application. So we set up China Application Center for the blockchain, and we design, we ask nationally, make the national competition to let people, entrepreneur, propose what's the scenario you can make application for the blockchain, and there's very successful competition in China. Has been a year, and now we work with Ukraine, with Georgia, we try to globalize. So that's, you need application to convince people. And the third, I would think, still blockchain is like very early stage of, just like 20 years ago, internet. Most people don't trust you, so we are still alone. So we like to working together. So set up union to make every field, every different angle, people working together. So that's why there is a 3 or 4 association in China is set up privately, and also there is one globally set up. It's called blockchain. It's called Global Blockchain Business Council. Right now, has over 30 countries had their member join that. They announced in Davos last January.
Yep.
So that's one. So I think deal with regulators, make more application scenarios, working together. That could, at this moment, will help blockchain promoting globally.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, thanks very much for sharing your perspective. It's probably time to move into some questions now. I think we've tried to kind of cover blockchain, but also its context in this kind of very rapidly changing ecosystem of digital economy.
Can I do a really quick experiment? I think I know what's going to be. But you mentioned the hype cycle. Gartner says we're at the height of the hype cycle. I'd just like to ask the audience, raise your hand if you own a cryptocurrency. Yep, I've done this with a lot of different audiences. There's only a few hands. And with such a prestigious and well-educated audience, and no one owns them yet, I don't think we've hit the height of the hype cycle yet.
Bitcoin is pretty expensive now, so.
The cost of an individual Bitcoin doesn't matter. It's divisible to 9 decimal places.
Yeah.
If you don't own, if no one here owns it yet, how is it at the height of its hype cycle? That's what I'd like to know. Maybe we're in an intermediary little bubble, but like, until the vast majority of the population is using a blockchain in their daily lives, we have not hit the hype cycle.
Fair point, and that was the FT. So it was me quoting the FT, quoting the Gartner guys. But perhaps some questions from the audience. I think there's lots to cover. In the front row. Oh, you've got the microphone. Go right ahead.
Hi. This has been an amazing presentation, actually shocking presentation, because about the cars that don't need the driver anymore, I read that there will be 10 million jobs will be lost in the world. Do you have any idea, can you guess any number of the jobs that will be lost in the world, and what we are going to do with jobless people of that number? And the population of the world is increasing. Any idea?
Who wants to grab that one? The young optimist.
I am indeed an optimist.
I don't know if you're going to be optimistic, but since you're young, I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I just want to bring the number, actually. From the projection from World Economic Forum, we are expected to lose 2 to 3 million jobs in developed world in the next 5 years, up to 2020, I'm sorry. Which means in the next 4 years, we're going to lose around 2 million jobs, which I think is not the number which kind of should make us panic. Given the population, the total population of the developed world, say 12 countries, and the level of unemployment currently there, I think the rate of job loss in the short-term period is not that significant. But shall we have unexpectedly another major transformation or disruption in automation, of course, that rate will change. But as of now, I think it's kind of under control, rather, to me. Thank you.
Could I be slightly more pessimistic?
Absolutely.
Well, I think job loss is a huge threat, and sure, it may be 2 million in the near future, but taking cars as an example is a great one. Uber have built a huge business of drivers, but as soon as Uber don't need drivers, well, all our fares go down, but suddenly we're out of drivers. Accountancy is, I think, at huge risk, especially if blockchain becomes more pertinent. Legal clerks are at huge risk. Paralegals. Every industry is going to be more and more impacted by machine learning and the advances in natural language processing. And I think society is going to have to face up to the fact that I believe there's going to have to be a shift. Because every time in the world we've seen mass unemployment, well, people get angry when they're hungry. And this won't just be the hungry that we've seen before. This isn't just going to be the guys that previously swept the streets. This is going to be people that have a university education, that came out of university and thought, well, hold on, I worked hard, where's my job? So I think there's going to have to be a fundamental shift in the way that perhaps our economies deal with these things.
Brett?
Just something also. Hello? Seems to have gone off.
The authorities have oh, there you go.
All right. There's also a bit of a problematic narrative that's put out in the press about, quote unquote, robots are taking our jobs. Robots aren't taking our jobs. It's the people who take our jobs are the same people who've always taken your jobs. It's company management who fire people to save costs and who invest in technology. This process has been going on for hundreds of years, where essentially if you can make more money in the long term by investing in technology, you replace workers with technology. And that's the same thing. And I guess the question now is the fact that this process seems to be escalating in its speed, and that we're actually moving further and further up the kind of frontiers of the jobs. Because previously there was this thing called the Luddite fallacy, which said, low-level workers, when they lose their jobs, actually what happens is that they will then get higher value jobs and start to do more meaningful work. But that process doesn't look like it necessarily can carry on going. Eventually it sort of tails off, and you basically have potential for mass redundancy and highly concentrated ownership of essentially machines, which is when you get into sort of like Marxist theory around extreme revolutions, which is why you'll start to see these debates happening right now about basic income and so on. So I think it definitely has to be thought about, but I mean, it's very unequally distributed around the world, because when I'm from South Africa, you don't see this process happening everywhere in South Africa, but it's in certain types of places you're seeing it now.
Go ahead. In the back. No? Go ahead, yep.
Hi everyone, Alexander Tabak, CEO of Public. It's a blockchain-based distributed platform for content distribution that implements a fair reputation mechanism. So I would have two questions for the panels. The first one is about regulators and regulation. We have spoke a lot about it. I'd like to know what do you think regulators should have as an approach towards blockchain startups and fintechs in general? Should they regulate first, or should blockchain act first and get regulated afterward, like some of the companies have done, like Uber or WeChat, for instance? And the second question is about consortiums in general. We have seen a lot of different consortiums, banking, insurance, and technological consortium popping up last year, like R3, B3I, or Hyperledger, or even Ethereum Enterprise Alliance. I'd like to know, what do you think about the rise of these consortiums? If it's not forcing the ecosystems to build standards that will cause problem later on, because everybody will have different standards and will have difficulties in creating interoperability? Or do you think it's good for the ecosystems to have different groups of think-outs, and that will end up in potentially convergence?
Who wants to grab that one? Yeah, Tyler.
So I work for Consensus. Consensus is the largest global development software studio for blockchain. We engage with all of the major consortiums around the world that are forming. And just to put it in some context, a company that has no blockchain expert is naturally going to reach out to discover and educate itself. And one of the natural ways to do that is a consortium. It's a very non-threatening way of an industry coming together. And we often like to talk about the blockchain as a transformation from company-level infrastructure that's being built to industry-level infrastructure that is built together. And so consortiums make a lot of sense for these companies to join in and participate in the standardization process. Like I said, this ecosystem is very fragmented right now. All new technology starts in the fragmentation phase. Consolidation and standardization is the natural next step, and consortiums are playing a big role in doing that. And just to be clear, we're seeing consortiums around, like there's a massive energy consortium that's forming, there's banking consortiums, there's insurance consortiums, there's pharmaceutical consortiums, and they all are trying to look at the outstanding problems they have in their industry and how blockchain is going to solve them. And one of my favorite phrases that was used, and I've kind of adopted it for myself, is that blockchain is a team sport. I just want to let that sink in a little bit. That means that companies, governments, especially regulators, and individuals can co-participate on a platform together. One of the, just to mention just the regulatory aspect for a second, the biggest fans that we have when I build systems for companies are the regulators of those systems. Because I can give them a node on the network and they can get the data that they need in real time to interact with the company around potential flags and warnings. So we're going from a place where regulators are interfacing with a company every 6 months when they read through a massive document of all of the things that have happened, and they go through and they try to find where they went wrong, to changing that to a relationship where the regulator in real time is interacting with the operator and finding where the missteps before they happen too far.
So the answer, so you're answering, you're saying, look, his question was regulate first or let them develop and then regulate. You're saying develop and regulate together.
Well, they naturally should,
yeah.
And regulators want to engage. They see the potential. I gave a talk where I talked about how the Deepwater Horizon event, that big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, how that could have happened differently if a regulator had real-time access to the decisions that were being made and the signatures, like the approval signatures by the managers at BP as they were actually drilling the well. What if we can get that kind of engagement in real time to avoid massive disasters in our financial industry, like Lehman Brothers, or our energy industry in oil and gas, or even our insurance industries when they can't pay when they have like a major hurricane come through and decimate a city, right? If we can be engaging in real time, maybe we can avoid some of these, or at least we can learn faster. And that's really the proposition to the regulators on blockchain. But consortiums are a natural extension of companies just wanting to learn about this new technology.
Anyone else want to comment on this?
I would say I completely
Sounds very utopian, by the way,
yeah.
And not how governments usually work, but...
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with the possibility that the reality, take the Deepwater Horizon example, you don't need, blockchain would be a great technology for it, but you don't need blockchain for example, for workflow management or business process management. We could have already had a system built on one of the numerous either open source or closed source pieces of software that could have managed every single one of those decisions and prevented the drilling of the well without the rubber stamps or without certain pieces of data being entered so the system signed off it was safe. What regulators have always done, which I think needs to change, is they've always worked slower than the developers, than the community, than the innovators. And I think we're at a time now where governments have to realize they have a role as being an innovator in the same way we do as entrepreneurs.
I just wanted to add, because I think what Tyler was emphasizing on the real-time capability of that process, which is very much potentially facilitated by blockchain. It's true that the technology was there. It could have been avoided, but it's also where you are in the bureaucracy and not very much real time, or where the technology actually facilitates a smooth, flawless transition of these decisions. And another example Tyler actually made about banking in underprivileged regions where they don't have banks, naturally. The experiments were carried out with mobile phones when the penetration was raising. Now it's like 70% in the world, I believe, or so. And people were empowered with those banking accounts through the phones. But that left as an experiment in general, isn't it? And it didn't very much penetrate in general because the banks also should need to have their incentive. But when we say, I'm sorry, that the blockchain is empowering, it's actually adding some opportunity there because of the fee goes down, the cost of the transactions, they go down. So this experiment could have succeeded maybe more with blockchain in those regions.
Okay. Questions? Riz?
Hi there, Riz Khan. Just a quick question. Having just started a company, I've learned to completely hate banks. Being based out of Dubai, going to the US, working out of London, it's become almost impossible to really easily function across borders when transferring currencies and so on. And I certainly know from a lot of the media coverage that cryptocurrencies are seen as a threat to security and so on. The involvement of regulators obviously is an important factor because it can then actually standardize things, it can actually provide security. But then there's the issue of security agencies in conflict with perhaps banking regulators or those who might regulate from a more e-commerce perspective. Where is the balance struck where, for example, cryptocurrencies can play a role that the average person can use them, can bypass perhaps the bureaucracies and kind of ridiculous administrative diligence that's required sometimes that doesn't actually go into real diligence but simply into fear. At what point can we see a transfer into it being a kind of a daily use environment?
So here's the irony. And this is the beautiful irony about the whole thing, and I'm sure I'm about to get shouted down by the boys at that end of the table. But for me, the beautiful irony of this is Bitcoin solves, in many ways, or a cryptocurrency or a digital currency, in many ways solves your issue, in that it's peer-to-peer transfer, you can be paid by anyone, anywhere in the world, and that's fantastic. The difficulty is, until it's adopted by everybody, until it's ubiquitous, you as a business cannot choose it as your primary payment method. And you know what's going to make it ubiquitous? A company that provides it in a really convenient, packaged way. And this is, for me, the beautiful irony of a lot of the debates that circle around this technology.
I mean, there's a lot of claims made in the early days of Bitcoin that it'll be this sort of wondrous thing for remittances and so on. And in reality, as Luke's pointing out, Bitcoin is not attached to any real economy, by which we mean most currencies are actually fused into a real network of people who produce goods and services. And right now, Bitcoin doesn't do that. It can act as a kind of sort of an intermediary currency between, or sort of intermediary asset between other currencies, but that process itself becomes expensive. But one thing that is being talked about a lot in the international banking sector is this, what you kind of alluded to, is what they sometimes call the problem of bank de-risking, which is essentially that the anti-money laundering regulations and various types of anti-terrorist financing regulations have increased the costs of compliance for banks. And when banks are making profit calculations, when they make these risk-return calculations, they say, how much money are we going to make relative to how much we have to spend and how much risk we're going to take on. And with that increased cost of the regulation, they start to say, you know what, it's not worth our while actually serving people in places. So they start to cut correspondent banking ties to do international money transfers with banks, say, Angola. But I have been to these various international forums, where I've seen, say, for example, IMF officials saying stuff like, well, we recognize there's this problem of the breakdown of the global correspondent banking system, and we think that maybe distributed ledger technology or blockchain technology could solve this problem. And I always find this fascinating because in some ways what they're saying is, we're hoping that there's some kind of illegal way to do this thing, right? Because somehow this other technology is not going to be subject to the regulations that the normal financial sector is. So temporarily we might be able to avoid this problem, but then somehow, this is one of the sort of technological magical thinking, I think. This is often a political problem why this money can't move. or else maybe a business model problem. But sure, the technology can lower the costs, but it doesn't necessarily solve it.
I have a comment of how you're going to see it in your daily life. So right now you can go onto your Android or iOS phone, you can download a chat app called status.im or Toshi, and you can actually interact using a blockchain on like a WhatsApp type of interface, but you can send each other cryptocurrency. I'll give you another example. We're working on a platform called Grid Plus, where solar panels will tokenize the energy as it's being created when it goes into batteries. And then those batteries can actually sell that energy off to the grid when the grid needs it the most, and actually balance a major problem we have with renewable energy, which is we have massive ramp-ups in when renewables are effective, and then massive drops, like when the sun goes down, where you have to have power plants charge up really fast, and it's hard on their infrastructure in order to maintain the equilibrium of the grid. And so we actually think that we can solve this problem by creating distributed, decentralized markets for energy. And I think that's an impact that an individual with a solar panel on their house is going to see within the next year to 2 years.
There was a question right up front.
Guy Gerazeran, Blockchain R&D Hub. Not a question, but I would like to make a comment. And second, Brett's perspective, because I think it is written like alternative finance, and he's an alternative voice with the panelists, by trying to defend the future of peer-to-peer economy that is here already. I think, back to my mind, I think many of the people here would probably not have a very clear understanding what is going on, but I would like to bring the issue of Russia, feudalism Russia, moving into becoming one of the main exporters of grain in the world, #1 maybe, in few years because of the word cooperative, before 1914 even. So until the word blockchain hit me, I was wondering how this could happen. I think we are all missing one point, that we are all individuals and we have power to act. And when we say companies will solve everything for you, and we are making it happen for you, and so on and so on, we are forgetting that we have been trusting to this centralized power all our lives, to deliver the promise. And now it is coming that there is a hope, maybe somewhat utopic, that the society can take the charge, and a single person who wants to be in charge of his destiny will start, really realizing something using a technology. And the second thing is to answer the question of the companies. Look what is happening to corporate world. All young generation does not want to work for corporate world anymore. You see this sparkling energy that goes into startups. I think Kazakhstan is looking to start, lots of, innovative hubs and so on and so on to really address this issue. And countries who will miss this will see the globalization taking over. And blockchain is the first, maybe a birth that shows that there are processes that are inevitable. The globalization is here, and blockchain helps us to see alternatively what is happening and how we can solve as a society and as a global, power of people, how to interact with each other and, to be successful.
So we have some applause breaking out up here with fellow utopians. Well said. Other questions?
Good day. My name is Miraz. In this situation, it really concerns me because I now represent the youth community, millions of people from all over the world. So what I have a question and maybe a suggestion. I believe that if it's such a powerful platform, can such platform provide a social security cushion for the socially vulnerable strata of people who would lose their jobs or their profession, so that for some time, whatever it takes them to adapt, they're not left without a source of income. So to move to that basic mandatory income, for us to keep up with the times, globalization is happening. If you could speak about that, thank you.
Anyone want to cover basic income and actual developments of that? Want to go for it, Brett?
You don't need blockchain to implement basic income necessarily. There are attempts, people using blockchain technology to do basic income. But, I mean, think about the basic concept of basic income is that you tax people to get within an existing monetary system, and then you redistribute that in the form of an equal amount of money to everybody. So the first thing you have to implement a basic income system is you have to have a working currency. So for example, I've seen some slightly dubious attempts to create blockchain-based basic income systems where the people have a token that isn't yet used to do economic activity, and then they say, we're going to give you an equal number of these tokens. So we're going to give you an equal number of meaningless tokens, and this will somehow be a basic income. That's definitely not a way you implement basic income. You take a normal currency that already exists, and then you distribute it. And that can potentially be done using a blockchain infrastructure, but not necessarily. So I think it's a slightly different. I'm not sure blockchain's entirely a fundamental part of how you would do basic income in a nation-state setting.
I'm curious, how many on stage believe basic income will be an inevitability?
Which time frame?
Give it 30 years.
I think basic income or something, whether it's basic income or not, something's got to change, because the capitalist society depends on there being opportunity. The opportunity to work, the opportunity, the meritocracy. Without, and again, it depends on what time frame, and you don't need blockchain for this. We almost need a society, we need basically the appreciation of the fact that as we move forward, and as we do automate, and I know AI is a buzzword and robots are buzzwords and all that sort of stuff, but it's been said by not just me on this panel, there's going to be less opportunity to work as corporates strive for more and more profit, and to do that they automate more and more things. And there's only a certain amount of basic things we need as humans to live, right? We need food, water, and we need our brains occupied. So as long as we can pull those things off, which corporates can give us and automate a hell of a load of it, we're going to be in a tough spot. So if you take away the opportunity to work, or an awful lot of the opportunity to work, where do we give people their dignity, their self-of-sense, and how do we provide people the ability to live a dignified life when perhaps the companies aren't willing to part with cash just on an open basis?
Yeah. And
can I ask, I mean, you teach at Singularity University, of course, that whole hypothesis that technology breeds more technology, which automates. I mean, is that the question here? Are things going to evolve so quickly that, humanity won't be able to adapt, as we've seen previously? Change happens, a certain segment adapts, others move on, young people move on.
Bear in mind that Singularity University is in the context of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, a slightly utopian place.
Has a very big problem of conceiving of collective action. Yeah. So actually one of the most interesting things in blockchain is the possibility of conceiving of large-scale collective action. So a whole bunch of people all sort of collectively doing something, as Gagik was sort of getting to, this idea of massive cooperatives. Whereas in traditional Silicon Valley mentality, that's not a thing. The traditional Silicon Valley is the idea that there's an individual, a heroic individual, who goes out and creates something for all these other people. In that context, it's incredibly hard to imagine people getting together and saying, we want to stop something or we want to change something. The only possible action is an individual goes out on their own and does something. And this way you start to have this slightly kind of bizarre types of thinking, such as like, we're hitting ecological limits of our planet. Okay, what's the solution? oh, well, let's go to some other planets and get resources from there. I mean, this is a more plausible thought system in Silicon Valley than, hey, maybe we should all get together and decide to stop wrecking the ecological systems. So I think there's a lot of sort of bizarre mentalities you find in the technological sector, and I think the most interesting stuff coming out of blockchain, or in terms of truly disruptive things, would be these like large-scale collaborative systems that people are actually forming authentically new forms of economic activity and taking more personal responsibility in the process. And I've talked too much, so I'm going to stop.
Tyler?
I think one of the biggest promises of blockchain is, let's not talk about basic income, let's talk about basic opportunity. Allowing people to access the global economy is a huge impact that blockchains can have. And then whether that be through their identity, through cryptocurrencies, through voting, through registries, whatever it may be. But what I view as the potential here is we have an internet level type disruptive technology that is global, and we haven't seen the Facebooks and the Twitters and the WhatsApps and the Instagrams start yet. We're solving problems that we already had, and some of these potential mega giant opportunities could come out of a place like Kazakhstan. That's the change.
Well, any last questions? I think we're just about done. Good. Well, last one. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christian de Vartavant. I'm the head of academic relations in the Decent Foundation. Luke, I would like you to come back to something you said first. Congratulations on what you just said. I could not agree more, basic income and the rest. But you said something which disturbs me slightly as a person who supports the blockchain use. You said the end user is not, how did you put it? Could you please go back on this? You said end user would not be so implied in the using blockchain. Before I react on this, I want to make sure I got your thoughts clear. Could you repeat this?
I've said such a lot, I have no idea what you're referring to. But so just answer what you think I might have said, and we can go from there.
I'll go ahead. I think you said something like, what does it change for the end user? I think you said something like this. As a scholar, I can tell you that the blockchain technology is going to change immensely things because it will secure, for example, plagiarism of our work. But I will not extend on this. There are many, many uses that, for example, the Decent platform will provide. I just want to give you one specific example that seems to me very relevant of what blockchain technology can do in the future. Imagine an author whose daughter, an author who dies, and this person has a daughter, which is my case, as a matter of fact. Let's say I would die. Where would go the royalties of my work? What blockchain can bring, like a system, is that through smart contracts, through the Decent platform, for example, or any other platform, should I die, automatically the royalties will be reattributed to my daughter, whether I would ask for it or not. Would you think this is a good example of what could be done through blockchain for the end user?
Yeah, I think intestacy, I think digital rights management, I think all of these are potential uses. But your point pertained to me talking about the end user, right? So the consumer will have perhaps more options available to them. My point is that for technologies to become popular and to be adopted, they have to be made convenient. Right. So if I take digital rights management as an example, if I was starting for instance, blockchain digital rights, if I had a solution to digital rights management with blockchain, would I go out there and create a whole new platform? Probably not.
No.
Because Apple and Spotify and Amazon already have huge audiences that enjoy such convenience, which have artists contracted to them.
Right.
So I would provide a technology solution, much like Consensus is doing in many industries, that allows these guys to improve their own services.
Right. So I think you also will get my point about those who are not part of the Amazon system and have not a contract with such platform.
Well, look, Any last word? I think we'll wrap it up, but want to thank everyone for a very engaging conversation. Clearly, this topic is not going away, whether it's blockchain, basic income, or the overall impact of technology. I think that's something we're all going to be living and breathing in the coming years ahead. So thanks very much for your time today, and thank you, panel.
And of course, a big thanks to Greg Bushman for hosting that as well, please.